Chapter 3 of the Woodlanders finds Mr. Melbury pacing round his garden in the early hours of the morning, and he's a worried man. In fact, he's a worried man through most of the book, and with good reason. In this case, Mrs. Melbury comes out and finds him wandering round, presumably in his nightshirt, and tries to elicit from him just what it is that's worrying him. Who is it? The lady at the great house? No. The turnpike bonds? No. The ghosts of the two brothers? He shook his head. Melbury's anxiety regarding the lady at the great house is reasonable. She's his main employer, source of wood. There's also Mrs. Charman, which makes things worse. The turnpike bonds, he's a bit worried that they're going to keep producing dividend because he's relying on these for the money he needs to keep Grace in the state to which she should become accustomed. But who are the two brothers, and why is it that Mr. Melbury should worry about meeting their ghosts? There's an article in the summer 2016 journal by Anna Burton, which has a long and informative title, and it's a very informative article also, but it's mainly to do with the significance of woodscapes within Hardy's larger portrayal of landscape. And she quotes a passage from the first edition of the Woodlanders, in which they're journeying through Melbury Park, and it's mentioned that the park is popularly supposed to be haunted by spirits of the fratricides exorcised from Hintock House. Well, if they've been exorcised, they're ghosts. If they're fratricides, then obviously they've been murdering their brothers. So these are the people in question. But she goes on to say that the mention of the fratricides, though vague in itself, is Hardy's invention. And I'd like to investigate that perfectly reasonable contention, because all the other characters in the book are, of course, not real people. As you probably know, well, I'm sure you know, the early editions of the Woodlanders were set in the vicinity of Melbury Osmond and Melbury Park, then the later ones were moved up to Lions Gate and places like that. And her interest is in a tree called Billy Wilkins, which Hardy refers to as Great Willie, and she shows how this was sort of airbrushed out of the earlier editions in order to conceal the fact that the setting was in the Hintock area, allegedly to avoid upsetting Lord Dorchester. And I'll read you the full initial passage, apart from the Billy Wilkins bit, which is further back, and then the revised version when the novel was replaced in another area. The mare paced along towards Tutcombe Bottom, intensely dark now with overgrowth, and popularly supposed to be haunted by the spirits of the fratricides exorcised from Hintock House. Later, the mare paced along towards Marshcombe Bottom, intensely dark now with overgrowth, and popularly supposed to be haunted by spirits. So, Hintock House has gone, so no one's going to be able to spot the area by it being Hintock House. Great Willie's gone, as I've said. Tutcombe Bottom has become Marshcombe Bottom, which is an invented name, of course, and the exorcised fratricides have been also changed to spirits, so you can't recognise the place from them. But why should you recognise that is Hintock Park by mentioning the two brothers if they are, in fact, Hardy's invention? The third mention of the two brothers is later in the novel, when Fitzpiers is being regaled by the employees of Melbury with local stories, including the standard story of the spirits of the two brothers who had fought and fallen and had haunted King's Hintock Court a few miles off till they were exorcised by the priest and compelled to retreat to a swamp, whence they were returning to their old quarters at the court at the rate of a Cox Tried every New Year's Day old style. Hence the local saying, on New Year's tide, a cock's stride. So that's the full story. They did murder one another, they were exorcised, and they were indeed at King's Hintock Court, which, as you probably know, is based on the grounds of Melbury House. So that's a much more complicated story. Did Hardy make that up? No, he certainly didn't, because that is an example of a well-known motif in ghost stories, known as the Cox Tried Ghost, and occurs in various other places. And the rationale of the thing is that a spirit of a deceased wrongdoer refuses to rest. It is exorcised by priests and is then compelled to be constrained in a certain place, usually a river or a swamp, from whence it escapes at the rate of 1 Cox Tried a year till it gets back to where it started from. For example, Robert Fry of Yarty in East Devon died in 1725, but after his burial, the mourners returned to his house to find him sitting by the fireside. Some clergy were called to exorcise him, and they conjured him into a withy bed, from which he may return at the rate of a Cox Tried a year. Similarly, Squire Fulford haunted his former home in Dunsford, Devon, and was exorcised by the local parson to some sand by the river, from which every night he takes 1 Cox Tried nearer to Fulford House. So Hardy's obviously either found a Dorset version of this, or he has taken on board a version from elsewhere and modified it. Now, in geographical terms, these stories are not very widely distributed, with the exception of 3 Somerset examples, which you kindly referred to me very recently. All Cox Tried Ghost stories come from Devon or Cornwall. About 3 or 4 years ago, in this very room, we had a joint conference of the Folklore Society and the Thomas Hardy Society, Folklore and Literature, and the Devon folklorist Mark Norman gave a talk on Cox Tried Ghosts and phantom coaches, and he had been looking for Dorset Cox Tried Ghosts, and he said at that time, "I have checked just shy of 400 records of Dorset hauntings and have found none." That is, he found no Cox Tried Ghosts. So there must be some suspicion that Hardy could have got the story from elsewhere. Now, since Emma, his first wife, was born in Devon and lived for some years in Cornwall, there must be some question as to whether Hardy might have heard a Cox Tried Ghost story from her and subsequently appropriated it for use in the Woodlanders. There are several examples of Hardy's fiction being set in Devon or Cornwall, such as the novel A Pair of Blue Eyes and the short stories The Romantic Adventures of a Milkmaid, it's in Devon, and A Mere Interlude back in Cornwall. Nevertheless, there is no evidence in these stories of Hardy ever moving folklore in the direction of Cornwall and Devon to Dorset. On the contrary, in the small amounts of folklore he used in those stories, he actually imported it from Dorset. So it would not seem so likely that he imported a Cornish story into Dorset. And indeed, again, quite recently, I came across this in a 1996 local history by a man called Charles Barter, which not only records a Dorset Cox Tried Ghost tradition, but which also situates it at Melbury House, the setting for the Two Brothers story in the Woodlanders. If you know the area, I don't know whether these guys are called Browning or Browning, it's B-R-O-U-N, I'll say Browning. A story concerning the Browning family. Our 15th century lords of the manor has it that 2 brothers fought a duel and killed each other in the deer park. Each year they take a Cox Tried nearer to the house, and when they get there, the house will return to the Brownings. So that's the actual Melbury House Cox Tried story. Again, one has to say that I can think of occasions when Hardy either more or less invented a bit of folklore or otherwise modified it, and then it became taken back into the actual folk tradition. Think of the Napoleon at West Lower story in a tradition of 1804, and Hardy subsequently found there was such a tradition in the village, although you can show it actually came from Hardy's story. And there are other examples as well. So it just might be that someone read the Woodlanders and it told the other people in the village and it was passed on. I think this is doubtful because of the differences between the 2 stories. Hence, Hardy does not mention the name of the brothers, possibly to avoid upsetting Lord Ilchester again, because it shows it wasn't his house in the first place. He doesn't mention the name of the brothers, nor the tradition of the house returning to their family. Barter, the local history author, on the other hand, omits the site of the brothers' imprisonment in Tuck and Bottom, and the current the exorcism element of the story also. It's interesting that Barter gives the origin of the haunting as being the 15th century, since it's believed that given the exorcism element in Cox Tried Ghost stories, they might reflect Roman Catholic beliefs, and thus date from the pre-Reformation period, i.e. prior to the 16th century, which was just where Barter's story comes from. So where did Hardy get this local story? On the face of it, his most likely informant would have been his mother, Jemima, who was born in Melbury Osmond and as a young woman was employed in domestic service under the patronage of Lord Ilchester, who lived at Melbury House. So far as I know, there isn't actually any evidence that she ever worked at Melbury House. She worked for a member of the Ilchester family at Maid Newton and another one when she moved down to Stinsford. But one assumes she must have started off as a scullion maid, or however they started, before she moved on to become a cook. So she lived at Melbury Osmond, she more than likely worked at Melbury House, and she had ample opportunity to learn these traditions and pass them on eventually to Hardy. Nevertheless, I believe that Hardy could have obtained at least part of this material more directly. In the late 19th century, one of Hardy's admirers, a lady called Rebecca Owen, somehow, we never know quite how, managed to inveigle her way into Max Gate. No one else did, but she used to turn up and interview Hardy and record her recollections, which no one else seemed to manage. And she says, often Mr. Hardy has got traditions from old people who got them from old family servants of the great families, whose representatives now think that Mr. Hardy ought not to have published them. The great families, of course, included the Ilchesters, of whom Hardy wrote in his short story, The First Countess of Wessex, and who were the owners, of course, of Melbury House / Great Hintock House. Again, referring to Rebecca Owen's recollections, Mr. Hardy told me today, November the 12th, 1896, that he has known 8 of Betty's descendants, that's the First Countess of Wessex, 8 of her descendants from whom he has learned little facts which, had he known them at the time, he should like to have put into the story. And further, when he completed the First Countess of Wessex in 1891, Hardy wrote to Lord Lytton, and referring to a group of noble dames, which of course is the collection of stories within which Countess of Wessex is the first one, he said, talking about the collection, he put it together in a sort of desperation during a fit of low spirits, making use of some legendary notes I had taken down from the lips of aged people in remote parts of the country, where traditions of the local families linger on and are remembered by the yeomen and peasantry long after they are forgotten by the families concerned. So there seems little doubt not only that the Two Brothers was a genuine local tradition used by Hardy, but that he obtained it from local sources, possibly his mother, or even more possibly members of the family, or from family servants. Therefore, Mr. Melbury was quite right to be concerned about the possibilities of meeting these guys lurching across Melbury Park, but at least he didn't need to worry in that particular chapter, because that was written in the autumn, and the Two Brothers only appear on New Year's Eve. Old style. The other supernatural tradition of the Woodlanders I'd like to mention is recorded in chapter 20, and it's a Midsummer Eve divination. It's Midsummer divination, or attempted one. Fitzpiers is looking over his garden gate as 9 o'clock approaches on a summer evening, and he sees a group of young women passing by. His interest is immediately aroused. His landlady tells him that, it being Old Midsummer Eve, they were about to attempt some spell or enchantment which would afford them a glimpse of their future partners for life. Hardy goes on to reveal that the particular form of black art to be practiced on this occasion was one connected with the sowing of hempseed, a handful of which was carried by each girl. Unfortunately for us, the Hintock girls' courage fails, and they flee before the ritual is completed, and the reader is left unaware of the significance of hempseed in the divination. This is the point at which Sue Damson falls into the hands of Fitzpiers as they flee, or more likely vice versa, in the passage which we heard about earlier. So what did happen What was the significance of the Hempseed? What was going on? Well, at first, it seems that you can get the information from another Hardy novel, because Hardy writes again about Midsummer divination in Under the Greenwood Tree, where Mrs. Reason is describing how she found what her future husband was going to be in terms of occupation. I put the bread and cheese and beer quite ready, and as the witch's book ordered, and I opened the door, and I waited till the clock struck 12, and behold, I could see through the door a little small man in the lane with a shoemaker's apron on. That's Mr. Reason, who, despite his protestations, was a little small man, and of course was a shoemaker. Clearly, Mrs. Penny was using an alternative form of midsummer divination in an attempt to identify, successfully in her case, her future husband. But in order to ascertain the nature of the Hempseed divination attempted in Dorset by the Hintock girls, got to move away from Hardy temporarily to the recollections of William Barnes, writing in 1832. A maiden will walk through the garden with a rake on her left shoulder and throw hempseed over her right, saying at the same time, "Hempseed I set, hempseed I sow, the man that is my true love come after me and mow." Barnes goes on to observe, rather cynically, "It is said by many who have never tried it, and by some who have, without effect, that the future husband of the girl in question will appear behind her with a scythe." The use of hempseed as a divination in this way was first recorded in 1685 in a book called Mother Bunch's Closet, which quotes a rhyme which is almost identical to that used by Barnes, some 150 years later. Now, when the Hintock girls are on their way down to carry out the divination, they mention yet another one. One of their number has second thoughts and says, "I wish we had not thought of trying this, but had contented ourselves with the hole digging tomorrow and hearing our husbands' trades. It is too much like having dealings with the evil one to try to raise their forms." So what is this hole digging? Got the Hempseed, the witch's book, and so forth. And here's another one. Well, this one is actually recorded by Hardy himself in an 1871 notebook entry. "On old midsummer noon, dig a hole in the grass plot and place your ear thereon precisely at 12. The occupation of your future husband will be revealed by the noises heard." Well, this all seems very quaint. In fact, the various practices and beliefs in Hardy's novels may be seen by us as quaint old customs, but to the participants, they had a serious aspect. Indeed, they would not have been regarded as folklore at that time. You're looking back to the first half of the 19th century, but as having a rational purpose. For instance, so far as marriage was concerned, a young woman's prospects in life were heavily dependent upon her husband, and therefore some knowledge of his identity, or at least of his occupation, was much to be desired. This is emphasised by William Barnes in the same study I've already quoted regarding matrimonial customs. "When we think on the consequences of a woman's marriage, that she may be dragged into a long train of evils and her heart be broken by a profligate or indulgent partner, or be led smiling in well-being through life by a man of virtue and good sense, we cannot be surprised that young females hanker to know what sort of men the fates have given them." This anxiety of Dorset young women to obtain a husband, possibly at any cost, is reflected in a rhyme which was used by them at St. Catherine's Chapel, Milton Abbas. "A husband, St. Catherine, a good one, St. Catherine, but are a one better than nara one, St. Catherine? Any one better than none at all." St. Catherine was the patron saint of spinsters. Bit of an inappropriate person to pray to, actually, isn't it, when you're thinking of trying to get a husband? Well, there we are. So far as the content of these customs mentioned by Hardy in the Woodlanders is concerned, it should be noted that hemp can produce hallucinogenic substances. So its supposed ability to generate visions of future husbands need not seem too surprising. Particularly in Ireland, certain holes or caves have traditionally been regarded as entrances to the underworld or to purgatory. So a belief in the production of supernatural noise from holes at a particular time of the year may be understood. In this context, don't know whether you know these, there are two music barrows on Bingham Down near Weymouth. And if you go there at midday in the summer, you're supposed to be able to listen. You can hear music coming up out of the holes, rather than the sound of shoemakers, which is what you hear on Midsummer Eve. To return to the two brothers, I've mentioned that their story might represent the post-Reformation survival of a belief in the efficacy of exorcism by priests. Indeed, some Cox Tried stories actually insist that the priest who carries out the exorcism must be a Roman Catholic. And in one of them, actually, they can't get one, so they've got 12 Anglican priests in order to try to get the same effect. In the Mowbray-Osmond version of the story, the motif of the return of the Browning family may reflect a theme in folklore whereby a former golden age will return one day. This idea underlies the various legends in which King Arthur or King Alfred or Sir Francis Drake is asleep under a hill, ready to awake when England is in danger. Although I've got a little extra time, I've cut out all the next bit. I had hoped to talk about the folklore in some of the short stories which Hardy set in the Mowbray-Osmond area. It's got wraiths, which is people who you see their ghosts while they're still alive, the miller moth, which comes out of people's mouths as they're dying, churchyard porch watch, when you see the people going to die in the subsequent year coming out before you, and so on. But that must await another occasion. So I leave you with this thought, particularly if you plan to be in Melbury Park around about New Year's Eve. The Woodlanders was published, as we've seen, in 1887, 130 years ago. 130 Cox Trieds. They must be getting pretty close to the house by now.